Hello and welcome to another update of dowsing the Templar line and some of the other lines. This last weekend I went out past Vyskov towards Kromeriz and mapped a number of lines as I looked to move the Templar line further to the east. I suspect that it goes through Kromeriz, and after that weekend I can definitively state that it does in fact go through Kromeriz, but stopping along the way to look at some of the other lines was also incredibly interesting. And the first stop was a place called Nožice, and this is an early Stone Age settlement that was also settled by the Slavs and the pre-Slavs, and it was an early castle in the 13th century here, which was replaced by this zamek a bit later. The first mention of the town is in 1238, and I was attracted by the church, which is St. Martin's Church. It stands on the site of an older chapel that was mentioned in 1384. The current church is from the 1700s, and the zamek was based on this fortress that was first mentioned in 1384 as well. As you might guess, a couple of lines run through the chapel and the zamek. In fact, the male line runs through the chapel, and the female line runs past the chapel and the zamek a little bit further down the street through what turned out to be a swimming pool area. That in fact is pretty typical, that the female line likes to pass through swimming pools and springs and fountains and schools, and the male line often passes through churches and castles. This is the swimming pool area of the line. I then went back a village because I'd seen this interesting looking church as well, and again this is an area where there's a prehistoric settlement, but by the Slavic era it was in existence, and the first mention is in 1276. The church is St. Wenceslas, and that's probably based on a 10th century wooden church in the Slavic era. And again, I found the male line passing through the St. Václav church, and I was interested in the weather that day and looking at this beautiful little bit of a rainbow that suddenly appeared as I was dowsing for the female line, which went through this area of, shall we say, water treatment. And if you look past through the fence there, you can also see, I think, a well head for water. So again, this is where the female line ran, the male line through the church and the religious complex, and the female line through an area dedicated towards the treatment of water, and in fact through this gymnasium / swimming pool complex on the other side of the street. It's really fascinating to me that we see this arrangement of the lines and how they sort of line up with parts of the landscape, with the male line often running through the religious complex, in this case this church, and the female line looking for natural springs and fountains and water and schools. It just seems to be the case over and over again. At the back of the church was some interesting old tombstones from probably the previous church on display, as well as some architectural features of interest, as you can see. I then moved on to the village of Tishgin, and this has a first mention in 1274, although it's said to be older than 1000, and there is the remains of a tower, fortress and/or monastery in the area. This is the church through which the male line runs. I also found a vortex in the area where two of these type 4 alignments intersected. However, there's absolutely nothing there, and that just goes to show that there doesn't always have to be a magnificent monastery on the place of a vortex. The vortex is on the other bank where those trees are. I could feel it, I could sense it, my sticks pointed to it, but so far as I know, there was never anything there. Jumping back in the car and heading in the direction towards where I was headed, I then saw this church on a hilltop and investigated that. It's the Church of St. Andrew. The current building dates to 1772, but it was built on another church that dates back 722 years earlier. I then discovered this marvellous chateau in a place called Drnov. It was originally a Neolithic settlement, but the first recent record comes from 1316, obviously it's older, and the fortress was first documented in 1414. I did discover a completely new major energy line running through this building, which I was also able to track further a little later in the day. This is the Church of St. Michael in a nearby village. It dates back to its first mention 1351. The church is mid-14th century. So I'm stood in the Templar female line just before Kromeriz, which I'm sure it passes through now, but will be another day's work. And it passes through the cross that you can see on the top of the hill. The female line of the Templar often does pass through crosses, and in this case that's exactly what it does. And there is the cross on top of the hill, and this is where I chose to stop for a quick cup of tea and admire the scenery. And this is my pack, just in case I have to get out and walk somewhere, my dowsing rods, the entire side of my chimney, which is a great vehicle for doing this kind of activity. And I ended my day following the Templar line in towards Kromeriz, in fact to this hill that overlooks Kromeriz and is the site of this reservoir and waterworks as well. And as you might guess, the female line not only goes through that, but it also goes through the recreational area as well on top of the hill. The hill was also the site of an ancient settlement, so far as I can establish, and was also then used for this water reservoir. In 1690 a chapel was built to St. Barbara, from which it gets its name, and a way of the cross, or the Stations of the Cross, led up the hill to the chapel. This has now been all dismantled, I guess in favour of this waterworks. The hill also afforded me a wonderful view of Kromeriz, and there you can see the Archbishop's Palace and the major churches and the mountains in the distance, and across in that direction is where the Templar line heads and will eventually take me once I get there. I can't wait. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. This is what it looks like on a map in terms of the different lines that I was following. The one going 45 degrees is the new one that I found. The one moving into Kromeriz is the Templar, and some of the churches were on that yellow and green line that is shown to the north of the map. Still lots of work to do to make the border with Slovakia or Poland, but I can't wait to get into Kromeriz and try to track the line eventually to Svarti Hostin, which lies in those mountains, and I do believe is where the Templar line will ultimately take me. Please do like and share if you enjoyed this, and check back regularly for updates. Thank you very much. Goodbye.